During the 1940s and 1950s, domestic life was overwhelmed by military engagements such as World War II and the Cold War, which shaped conflicts in America. The idea of the Anglo-Saxon race being superior to all other races generated issues of nativism during World War II and conformity during the Cold War, both of which stemmed from the fear of anarchist or communist. Unequal distribution of civil liberties, social justice, and the American culture were all challenged in the Homefront during these international conflicts. Any foreign immigrant or minority was seen as a threat to whites for taking their jobs and disrupting their way of life. As the wars progressed, America's role in society was being affected and questioned in various ways. During World War II, African Americans were able to raise awareness to the lack of civil rights, but still suffered from intense violence and segregation, and Jewish refugees were seen as communists and a threat to American democracy. During the Cold War, youth rebellion arose as a thrill or escape for teens from social standards, and cultural mainstream mores like conformity and uniformity were being rejected through the refusal to accept traditional way of life and roles. In the 1940s, during World War II, African Americans gained momentum in fighting for civil rights through their contributions in the war, but they still suffered injustice through violence such as lynching, segregation in the armed forces, and the Relocation to Africa program. According to the NAACP papers of January 1940 on Lynching Goes Underground, it states that African American lynching has increased over the years and mob activity has been changing to stay out of the media. Instead, whites gather to find a Negro who committed a crime, real or fake, and do the job by murdering the victim, vanishing the body, and escaping with no knowledge of what happened. This depicts the cruelty and the treatment of African Americans at home. African Americans are dragged around by civilians, and authority fails to speak up or recognize the discrimination. These acts intensified during the war, which led to attempts to pass anti-lynching bills. Furthermore, in an excerpt from Walter White in the NAACP papers on January 27, 1942, he states that the situation of African Americans is becoming worse because they are being treated unfairly in the armed forces, employment industry, and their race is being politically ignored. They are also being discriminated against by the refusal to accept a Negro's blood donation. This illustrates African Americans as people who have gained the opportunity to escape the rural poverty and aid in the war effort by either joining the military or migrating to the north to help the war production, but are still not granted any social justice for their massive aid and for risking their life for the country that is treating them poorly. The war caused blacks to undergo many hardships, which showed no change to their civil rights. In the Lister Hill Papers by Senator Theo Bilbo to Deer College on February 4, 1939, he introduces a bill in the Senate to make voluntary amends to African Americans by providing a resettlement program to Africa. This portrays the whites attempting to redress the injustices done to African Americans by providing them a way out of the country and an escape from American society, which benefits themselves and the whites. By displaying recognition towards the prejudices of the race, African Americans gained some support in fighting for their rights, but they were still too weak to exercise absolute change. World War II portrayed the extreme treatment of African Americans through lynching, segregation, discrimination in society, and a voluntary relocation program to Africa. Even though none were gained, the war raised awareness and polarized one's stance to either opposition or support for their civil rights. In addition, during World War II, Jewish refugees endured a similar form of hatred because they were seen as communist and a threat to American democracy and society. The Jews were associated with communism due to the rise in the Nazi government led by dictator Hitler and the rise of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that his German race was superior and the Jews were a threat to his ways. This led to an increased Jewish population seeking refuge in the United States. In the propaganda flyer produced by America, it represents the influx of Jews in the United States and calls for their deportation because they are invading the Roosevelt administration and taking jobs away from Americans. The whites blamed the Jews for the 12 million white American workers that were jobless. All coming from different accounts such as Ben Franklin and Samuel Roth, the Jews are depicted as communists or anarchists who are beasts and need to be excluded. The propaganda called for American people to realize the negative impact of Jews on the American government and to join the anti-communist movements to remove them from American society. World War II caused this intense discrimination towards the Jewish refugee population who are a threat and a suspect to any wrongdoing in America. Furthermore, in a conversation between Mr. Kramer and the chairman about the immigration of Mr. Havener on May 18, 1939, the chairman questioned the reasons behind Havener's re-entrance in the United States, even though he has previously lived here. The chairman refused to let him back in because his wife has Austrian ties, he has lived in Germany, and applied for entrance into the United States after Hitler's takeover. The chairman viewed him as a threat and refused to let him back in even though he has relatives here and has committed no crimes. This depicts the cautions taken by America to avoid any communist ties that might threaten the American government or democracy due to the war. The Jews were discriminated against harshly even though they were just seeking refuge from the injustices done to them in their home country, Germany. During World War II, the Jewish refugee crisis caused a rise in propaganda and intolerance against Jewish immigrations in the United States because they were taking jobs away from whites for cheap labor, and their background in association of communism became a threat to the United States government. In addition, during the Cold War, in which we fought the spread of Soviet communism, Americans developed the fear of anything un-American that went against the traditional ways, such as the rise of youth rebellion. The spread of rock and roll music, a combination of African American and country music, led to a widespread interest in youths revolting by dancing and listening to the race music that was undesirable in society. According to the YouTube clip of Elvis Presley on the Milton Berle show, he performed the song Hound Dog with hip-grinding dance moves and music that made females go crazy and be head over heels for him. In the pictures, you can see the young woman surrounding him in a frantic state of awe instead of doing the domestic work and sitting at home. The younger generations began an uprising for the thrill and escape, but also for the freedom against the restrictions in society on both genders, but especially women who had limited liberties. This caused the rest of America, especially the older generations, to worry that Elvis's music and dancing is impairing the morality of young Americans because it caused the youth rebellion to be more prevalent. The Cold War also led to the assumption that the rise in youths revolting was an act of communism infiltrating and damaging our society. Furthermore, in the 1955 clip from the movie Rebel Without a Cause, Jim Stark is depicted as a rebellious teen who enjoys his freedom with cars and other activities, and when things go wrong, such as when the teen hits a kid with his car, he becomes confused and unsure about his role in life and how he should act or if he should turn himself in to the police. This depicts the change in how men are seen in pop culture and their roles being altered, in which they are being more ambiguous and reckless. The youth also becomes more unsure about their role in life and society. Many teens related to this rebellion and ended up turning to crime as an answer because it's something unusual and exhilarating. Compared to cultural conformity, this depicts the new generation as hurt. The Cold War caused a rise in youth rebellion due to pop culture music and movies that encouraged the behavior and classified it as okay, but it also created fear in Americans because they believed it was an act of communism taking over America by corrupting its youth. On top of that, the 1950s Cold War caused Americans to reject cultural mainstream customs like conformity, to exercise moral complacency and focus on individualism due to the rising challenges against the goodness and superiority of American way of life. The social criticism that emerged stemmed from the idea that the traditional expectations and responsibilities were unreliable and faulty. According to the excerpts from John Kerouac's novel, On the Road, he represents the views of the Beats, a group of artists and writers who express the rejection toward middle-class values and the materialism of consumer culture that urged people to never stop or give up on pursuing their own goals. They rebelled against the traditional roles of women staying inside the house and raising the kids with one husband, and instead gave into a life full of excitement and energy by reckless use of drugs and other activities. In Kerouac's novel, he emphasized the importance of finding and satisfying yourself, not others. The war affected this view because people began transforming themselves in the midst of consumerism, conformity, and the fear of anti-communism. Furthermore, in Malvina Reynolds' song Little Boxes on YouTube, she refers to the upper-middle-class white suburbs as little boxes on the hillside because of their uniformity and conformity to culture. Reynolds displays a tone of criticism in her voice and rejection toward the suburban neighborhoods such as Levittown, which included families all of the same size, race, and some with higher-order education and occupation. They discriminated against anyone other than white middle class and any woman who was not a housewife. All the houses looking like little boxes showed the development and consistency created by the war because of the fear of communism, in which everyone had to be a certain way or they became an outcast and a suspect. This was rejected and people began highlighting individual qualities and unique way of living over uniformity. The Cold War caused Americans to reject conformity and called for change in the American way of life through literature, music, and the Beats. This caused a rise in rebellion and hostility towards traditional roles of women in domestic life in the white suburban neighborhoods. In conclusion, both World War II and the Cold War ignited many conflicts on the home front related to culture and equality of personal liberties. During World War II, African Americans and Jews were treated with harsh discrimination and were inferior compared to whites. During the Cold War, youth rebellion and rejection of cultural norms were both accepting towards minorities and consisted of white Americans. In the 1940s, African Americans raised awareness to their civil rights, but there were no gains because they still suffered from violence, segregation, and discrimination. This was just the beginning for the African Americans and led to the start of the civil rights movement. The Jews were denied entrance into the United States because they were taking white jobs for cheap labor and their background consisted of communist ties. During the Cold War, youth rebellion arose from the restricted liberties and the excitement of revolting. The rejection of culture more, such as the traditional lifestyle, shaped the modern society today and was just the beginning of counterculture. All these created some type of fear among Americans at the time, but they all ranged from different intensities and discrimination or disapproval by whites who deemed themselves superior. In the end, the wars had drastic, life-changing effects on the home front and has left a lasting impact.